Chimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Chimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Chimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Qajar is a peninsula at the southeastern reaches of Arvel. It is fortified by a great wall along its slender neck end, coupled with most of its coast being tall cliffs and mountains along the northwest. It is surprisingly terrestrially isolated. Much of its fauna is surprisingly isolated, with dozens of endemic species and an absence of most of Arvel's iconic megafauna. Indeed, its largest native animal is an endemic sloth, which only weighs around 1 ton. Boar, deer, and common drake round out a fairly meager megafaunal herbivore cast. There is now a population of mammoths and Paleoloxodon, along numerous feral domesticates, though these were all introduced at varying points in the past few centuries. Instead of giant theropods and formidable vassal predators, the top-order carnivores are lions, leopards, and the common cockatrice. No other terrestrial region in the known world displays half this megafaunal endemism. It can be tempting to assume the lower latitude and constricted wall play a part, and certainly they contribute, and was indeed initially the assumption of the assembly, but they were informed that there was a far more sinister factor at play. But we'll address that at the end of the episode. Relations between Qajar and the Assembly are tenuous at best. Between a long history of humans only present in Qajar as slaves, and anti-witch sentiments in the Qajarith populace and human firearms showing up in rebel factions and slave revolts, the two factions have understandable ground for mistrust. Scholars of both factions, however, have overcome these concerns in the interest of exchanging data and study. While the Assembly has never been authorized to collect fossils from the peninsula directly, trade and purchase of fossils and secondhand study of the region's geography has painted a surprisingly comprehensive picture of Qajar's natural history, all things considered. What fossils have been made available for Assembly study paint a picture of a much different cast of megafauna to what is there today. This episode will focus on what Qajar may have looked like 14,000 years ago. It is assumed that back then the climate would be much as it is today. Thanks to the wind currents of the eastern half of the peninsula would be quite humid, with lush forests and swamps, often compared to that of the southeastern US. The mountains to the north, from which most of the wind blows, result in an increasingly arid territory as one travels west. While there are ample rivers that flow down this basin, the worst of the storms are broken up by the northern mountains, so it is a fairly dry and stable climate throughout, down to the southern coast. Then, as it is today, this would have been predominantly grasslands with a few scattered forests and pooled basin lakes. Most of the mountains would have been fairly arid, save the northern coast, which would experience among the most rain of the peninsula, and is now, it would be then, a lush rainforest. Spanning along 700 miles from coast to coast, this roughly circular peninsula has approximately twice as much territory as the Iberian Peninsula, to which it is often compared by members of the Assembly. While sauropods went extinct in southern Arvel, with the climate briefly and drastically altered 1.5 million years ago, a small population appears to have persisted in Qajar. It is unknown why they failed to reclaim territory in the mainland, with the mountains being a likely barrier, but this was the last mainland holdout of the temperate species of Qiporotitan. They populated Qadon and then Picardia at this time, or perhaps slightly earlier based on fragmentary remains of Qadon, suggesting an arrival as early as 3 million years ago, but this was their last mainland appearance. The Qajarith Titan would have been the largest animal on the peninsula by a significant margin, with the largest known specimen being a partial femur of a 40-ton animal. It would not be as large as the common Titan, though not far below average bulls, and certainly larger than their relatives in Picardia, thought to have descended from Qajarith keratoderms. Even if average specimens were smaller, with cows probably not exceeding 15 to 20 tons, they were still the largest animals in the peninsula. The second largest animal, or at least in the running, was the Hukelgor sloth. Little is known of this population. It appears they generally favored upland forests, which don't have the most abundant fossil record, but one fairly complete specimen was reported and confidently assigned to the genus Tectospilea. Their inclusion in the Hukelgor species, however, is debated. Morphologically, the skeleton appears identical to Arvelith Hukelgor. Their ancestors were likely a population from which the Qaline Islands and Picardian Tectospilea species are descended, so it is likely a closer genetic match for those. While their integument is not known, it is assumed that, like other temperate animals in this genus, they would have had some fur and are here reconstructed with the same white mantle as Taruk and Rokel Khan. Like their modern relatives, they would have been generalists, browsers, and grazers, bulk feeding on almost any available foliage, and sometimes scavenge or even killing the occasional prey item. 3 species of Proboscidean were also present. While there were Drenduga, which rival the Hukelgor in size, it appears they were a fairly rare presence toward this era 15,000 years ago. This may be surprising, since they appear to have been quite abundant earlier in Qajar's prehistory, though this may be an issue of sample bias. Mammoths, on the other hand, were still quite abundant in the more arid grasslands. The forests were home to the last of the mainland mastodons. Caprotrox, the genus assigned to the Picardian mastodon, is also usually given to this animal, though some favor keeping it as mammut, as it is likely descended from an American mastodon some 8 million years ago. Unlike the Picardian species, which rarely exceed 4 tons, this mastodon was around the same size as the Drenduga. The mastodon was a browsing specialist and mammoths fairly strict grazers, and this partitioning between the two likely allowed them to cohabitate without issue. Paleoloxodon, a generalist, could live on both diets. It seems that while this versatility was successful in many Qaline islands it populated and throughout southern Arvel, in Qajar, it seems this was to their detriment. A fairly complete specimen of a Baraphont, estimated at close to 5 tons, appears to have been competition from mammoths. They were mostly grazers based on tooth wear and their closest relatives, the woolly Baraphonts of southern Arvel and Picardia. They are often considered a subspecies of woolly Baraphont, as are the Picardian and a few Qaline Island Baraphont, though some have argued the diversity of woolly Baraphont justifies erecting their own genus and multiple species. The Qajarith Baraphont was certainly the largest member of the woolly Baraphonts. Some common Baraphont bulls can get larger than their biggest specimens. However, there are so few fossils of these animals that we must assume any preserved specimens represent the average, and many assume the Qajarith Baraphont likely represents the pinnacle of this clade in terms of size, even if we don't have any specimens that exceed the largest common Baraphont. Of the 3 giant Thescelosaur genera found in Arvel, only the Casctar has remains found in Qajar. Like their Arvelith cousins, they likely were generally upland fauna that would have seasonally fed in the lowland forests. From a massive femur, it seems Casctar of Qajar may have been the largest of their kind. The peninsula was also home to the largest species of Trechosaurus, with a partial skeleton in western Qajar, hinting at an animal that could reach 12 meters in length, rivaling the ridgeback Runendrake and the quadrupedal Netlaru of Kaishel as the largest known Elasmarians. It had especially tall nasal crests and long fangs as well. Though 8 species of multi-ton herbivore was certainly an impressive base of their caste, herds of kangaroo, camel, horse, and deer were certainly more abundant. The grassland seems to have been teeming with herds of these 4 mammal groups. The aurochs has not been documented, but it seems bison and rhinoceros were present, though likely would not have been as common as the 4 mammals mentioned above. A species of Arvelith moose appears to have been quite common in the forests, joined by bear sloths and a species of Procoptodon. Subadult dinosaurs of the giant species, along with a few other elasmarians and thescelosaurs, would have rounded out the caste of herbivores between 300 and 1,000 kilograms. The Assembly has likened this caste of herbivores to a general union between fauna both north and south of the central Arvelith Mountains. Unsurprising, as this peninsula is equally accessible from both north and south of the mountains. The Highland ecosystem is not well sampled, though from one partial skeleton, it seems it was home to the largest species of primate, Gigantopithecus taki. The fragmentary jaw and limb bones suggest an ape that matched the average specimen of the Angaru, Pacardia's giant gibbon. The giant or caped monkey has not been confirmed from this time, but they have been found in earlier formations assigned to the southern mountains, and it is considered probable that they persisted to this time, just haven't been found yet. The highlands were also home to giant takin and woolly kangaroos. All this megafaunal prey, of course, supported a range of predators. Largest was a theropod originally assumed to be the Zentaur, either the same species or perhaps a distinct one. However, later studies and fossils sampled from southern Arvel prior to the cooling 1.5 million years ago suggest this was instead the last mainland holdout of Yagakaluba, the Megaraptoran which was apex predator of southern Arvel during the Anchored period. Their fossils have been found in Kadan, and it is generally assumed that this species was ancestral to the Oritaku of Picardia. Most large theropods are fairly fragmentary, and it is assumed that the same species, though it's possible Zentaur periodically meandered in and integrated with the local population of Yagakaluba, as has been proposed for whatever Epira Venator originally lived in Nikar, before Zentaur eventually integrated with and replaced them in the aftermath of the conclusion of the Anchored period. Some morphs of the living Zentaur may have also influenced this species leaving the peninsula. Yagakaluba is presumed to have been fairly similar to the Zentaur. In this reconstruction they are sewn with feathering quite inspired by the Oritaku, although their appearance here is speculative. What is known is that the uncontested apex predator of this environment would have been the Yagakaluba. No terrorbird fossils have been uncovered, nor have any cave lions or megaraptorans like the Darun. The Vassal Predators of Qajar were relics of what resided in southern Arvel during the Anchored period. Most abundant, as far as can be surmised within the bias of the fossil record, was Arctornis eschatos. This was by far the largest of the pheasant cockatrices, which were the dominant lineage of dromaeosaurs in the known world prior to the proliferation of the true cockatrice in the aftermath of the Anchored period. The Arctorn has in recent years been likened to Utahraptor, a robust dromaeosaur from Earth's prehistory, also around half a ton in weight. It is presumed that they would have been ambush predators, likely favoring more forested areas in the east and in the Highland boreal forest to the west, being absent in samples of the central prairies. The other vassal predator, or subordinate apex, was a mammal, the Qajarith hedgeback, Melatrox nerotensis. It is presumably quite similar to its sister species in western Arvel. This animal, like the Arctorn, was once common throughout the arid southern stretch of the continent, but perished with most of its prey 1.5 million years ago. Like the Arctorn, males are estimated around 500 kilos. Sexual dimorphism in the hedgeback is fairly noticeable, and it is likely that Nerotensis females were significantly smaller. Melitrox appears to have been restricted to the Highlands. The vassal of the prairies would have been juvenile Yagakaluba. Like the Centaur, juveniles of this large theropod would have been among the fastest animals in their environment, though well surpassed by the Qajarith cheetah. Would prey they were slower than, they likely would have outmatched in endurance. The Qajarith cheetah was likely the last member of this feline lineage in Chimere, though reports of panthers in the desert of western Arvel may instead be this lineage's final relic. They were abundant in the grasslands of Qajar, perhaps due to being more solid ground than much of the rolling steppes of southern Arvel today. There were also hyenas on these grasslands, red panthers in the wetlands, along with leopards in the forests. However, perhaps the most influential predator was one we would be far more familiar with: humans. At this time, two human species called this peninsula home: Altus and Chimerensis. Homo altus is the far more ancient resident of Chimere, with their ancestors first arriving 1.5 million years ago. They may not have rivaled the large theropods for top predator, but they quickly arose to the ranks of vassal predators in many ecosystems. They may not have lived in especially large groups, but even a small troop setting traps and armed with hand axes and spears would have been devastating. It is believed they were a significant factor in the extinction event that made the end of the anchored period so significant. It appears they initially preferred warmer climates, remaining in Nikar and northern Arvel for almost 1 million years. Around 600,000 years ago, an unknown innovation and dispersal event resulted in them spreading far and wide, reaching most continents throughout Chimere. They also notably spread to Qajar and the rest of southern Arvel for the first time in appreciable numbers. The subsequent extinctions, especially in southern Arvel, triggered a harvest, and it is thought these humans were almost certainly the inciting culprit. Homo erectus or heidelbergensis taken at this time were likely integrated into the Altus populations of southern Arvel and Qajar. Many animals native to Qajar were also driven to extinction by Homo altus shortly after their arrival. Indeed, it has been proposed that some animals, like the Drenduga, may have been rare as a result of overhunting by Homo altus. It is assumed that they, and the spotted hyena, much like what is seen in southern Arvel today, were likely violent rivals. Partial skeletons of both altus and hyenas have been reported with injuries from the other species. Homo altus is not only taller than most modern humans, their legs are proportionally longer. They seem to have favored open terrain, as they do today, making very efficient use of their long strides in running prey to exhaustion. The second human species found in the peninsula at this time, Homo chimerensis, was quite rare and seems to have generally remained in the forest. Compared to Homo sapiens, from which they are either descended or share close common ancestry, harvested around 250,000 years ago, they were short and sturdy. Compared to us and Altus, their legs are notably shorter. It seems they may have taken a long time to disperse from Nikar, perhaps only reaching Qajar as recently as 40,000 years ago, not long before they are believed to have dispersed to Picardia and the southern islands. Tool use by Altus and Chimerensis at the time are indistinguishable. Tools in the archaeology of the known world changed significantly each time Chimerensis first arrived. Altus tools development wasn't stagnant by any means, but these new humans certainly had a far greater diversity in their tools. There's some evidence that the new tool culture arrived before Chimerensis, perhaps traded through Altus groups or innovations of their own. If these new humans indeed brought new tools, the indigenous Altus were quick to adopt them and make their own improvements. There are likely some integration between the two species, though the extent of which is unknown to the assembly. It is often stated by anthropologists of the Great Library that integration between Altus and Chimerensis was minimal, though some in the assembly are skeptical of this claim. Homo chimerensis at the time does not appear to yet possess their slowed growth and long lifespan we see today. Likewise, Homo altus at the time was already taller than modern humans, though it seems their height did not reach the modern average of just over 2 meters. The difference now seems to be between Chimerensis and Altus were not so exaggerated back then. Maybe Altus just preferred open territory and Chimerensis favored woodlands, but answers would necessitate a very comprehensive study in land that, while safe for many of the dangerous animals, is not exactly welcoming to humans for the assembly. Thus is the assembly understanding of the prehistory of this peninsula around 14,000 years ago, when a third human species arrived. These peoples were quite small. Indeed, their skeletons are often mistaken for those of children between the ages of 6 and 8. Their short stature and neotenic traits mean that often adult teeth are the only obvious indicator of their age. The remains are often difficult for the assembly to acquire for a range of cultural reasons. The few that have been sampled already show signs that magic has delayed their aging by the time they arrived in Qajar. This is to be expected, as Picardian accounts from earlier attest to a wide range of horrid magics. The first children who at this time arrived in Qajar were refugees and pioneers twice over. According to Picardian oral tradition, they came to the great island having lost their own territory to a cataclysm. They already commanded and domesticated several strains of powerful magics, most notably enchantments of mind control. They allegedly betrayed the hospitality of the Picardian, leading to conflicts which resulted in the first children retreating to the Highlands. There were altercations back and forth, which neither faction seems to have claimed victory. For reasons unknown, the first children eventually left the Picardian Highlands, arriving in Qajar with overwhelming aggression. The peoples they encountered here, unlike the Picardian, did not develop alongside them or become familiar with their tactics and weaponry. Details are unknown, but it seems very quickly the first children enacted a purge of megafauna, including the genocide of native peoples of both human species. The assault ended in what seems to have been a very rapid mass extinction. Most animals over 10 kilograms were slain. This ecocide prompted an event now called the Interrupted Harvest, wherein the portal attempted to repopulate Qajar with flora and fauna from Pleistocene North America. Before the harvest could complete, more than a few of what is generally assumed to be dozens, if not hundreds, of pulses in these harvesting events, the portal was somehow trapped by the first children, halting the collection before it could even come close to completion. After purging most of these newly harvested animals, though they did miss or let a few survive, such as the sloth megalonyx, the white-tailed deer, and the American alligator, the first children constructed the Celestial Wall, which closes off the peninsula of mainland Arvel to this day. Eventually, through events only known through fragments and by means and times heavily debated among Chimeran and Assembly scholars, the first children went extinct. With their seemingly abrupt disappearance, the peninsula entered what is now known as the Age of Demons, wherein the homunculi and other entities the first children created took dominion over the homeland of their makers. After their reign ended was the Age of Witches, then the Dark Ages. Through these eras, Qajar has seen its ecology stabilize. While the wall and cliffside coasts mean it's generally terrestrially isolated, animals like the common cockatrice, Rugier lion, leopard, common peccary, mountain goats, and many other generally small animals have managed to make their way into Qajar. Massive herds of feral aurochs, common drake, camels, trocatul, and horses fill out the grasslands and forests. Mammoths and drenduga are also found here. Though these are now in great abundance of fauna, the biodiversity of Qajar is quite depaupered compared to most of Arvel, and the majority of these larger faunas are former domesticates of various civilizations past. Especially knowing what has been lost, Qajar now seems a shell of its true potential. Cheers to Arkland Archivist for sponsoring this episode. It was interesting to sketch out and establish what this unique region may have looked like prior to its anthropogenic cataclysm, which forever redefined Chimere. My great thanks to my Patreon patrons. It is important to me to keep Chimere from being behind a paywall. As such, there are no special benefits to joining Patreon, but it and video sponsorships are how I'm able to keep this project going. Thank you so much to those of you who have supported Chimere. Also, thank you for watching, as the ad revenue is a great way to support even if you're not in a position to join Patreon. Thanks again to Arkland Archivist for sponsoring this episode. I'll see you all in 2 weeks when we meet the Zolanitok, an enormous sea monster that resides in Chimere's deep oceans. Cheers, folks!